This is I Read Old Media. Tonight's story is from a book called Strange But True, Mysterious and Bizarre People, and the author's name is Thomas Slemen, or Slemen. It's Slemen. The title of the story is The Count Saint Germain. The Real Doctor Who? Question mark. When the English soldiers returned from the Holy Land after the Third Crusade came to a disastrous end in the 12th century, they brought back with them many fabulous tales of the mysterious Orient. One particular story they often told was of a man known in the East as the Wandering Jew. The story went as follows. In the judgment hall of Pontius Pilate, there was a Jewish doorkeeper named Cartaphilus, Cartaphilus, who had actually been present at the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. When Christ was dragging his cross through the streets on the way to Calvary, he halted for a moment to rest, and at this point Cartaphilus stepped out from the large crowd lining the route and told Jesus to hurry up. Jesus looked at Cartaphilus and said, "I will go now, but thou shalt wait until I return." The Roman soldiers escorting Christ to the crucifixion site pushed Cartaphilus back into the crowd, and Jesus continued on his way. Cartaphilus had no idea what Jesus meant until, many years later, he realized that all his friends were gradually dying of old age, while he had not aged at all. The doorkeeper remembered Christ's words and shuddered. He would wander the earth without aging until Christ's second coming. This tale was dismissed by the religious authorities of the day as an apocryphal yarn, and the legend of the Wandering Jew was later interpreted by the Christians as an allegorical story, symbolizing the global wanderings and persecutions of the Jewish race because of their refusal to accept Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah. The tale gradually passed into European folklore and joined the other fairy tales of the Middle Ages. Then, in the 13th century, a number of travelers returning to England from the continent spoke of meeting or hearing of a strange, blasphemous man who claimed he had been around when Christ was on earth. These curious reports were later strengthened in 1228 when an Armenian archbishop visited St. Albans. The archbishop told his astonished audience that he had recently dined with an unusual man who confessed to being Cartaphilus, the man who mocked Christ. Many more encounters with Cartaphilus were reported in the following centuries, and each meeting seemed to occur near and near to Western Europe. Then one day, in 1740, a mysterious man dressed in black arrived in Paris. The gaudily dressed, fashion-conscious Parisians instantly noticed the sinister stranger and admired the dazzling collection of diamond rings on each of his fingers. The man in black also wore diamond-encrusted shoe buckles, a display of wealth that suggested he was an aristocrat. Yet nobody in Paris could identify him. From the Jewish cast of his handsome countenance, some of the superstitious citizens of Paris believed he was Cartaphilus, the Wandering Jew. The man of mystery later identified himself as the Count of Saint Germain, and he was quickly welcomed by the nobility into the fashionable circles of Parisian life. In the distinguished company of writers, philosophers, scientists, Freemasons, and aristocrats, the Count displayed a veritable plethora of talents. He was an accomplished pianist, a gifted singer and violinist, a linguist who spoke fluent Spanish, Greek, Italian, Russian, Portuguese, Chinese, Arabic, Sanskrit, English, and of course, French. The Count of Saint Germain was also a fine artist, an historian, and a brilliant alchemist. He maintained that he had traveled widely, and recounted his many visits to the court of the Shah of Persia, where he had learned the closely guarded science of improving and enlarging gemstones. The Count also hinted that he had learned many arcane lessons of the occult. But what stunned his awestruck listeners most was his claim that he was over 1,000 years old. This assertion came about one evening when the conversation turned to religious matters. The Count movingly described Christ as if he had personally known him, and talked in detail of the miraculous water into wine event at the marriage feast of Cana as if he were describing a party trick. After this peculiar anecdote, the Count became tearful, and in a broken, uncharacteristically somber voice said, "I had always known that Christ would meet a bad end." The Count of Saint Germain also spoke of other historical celebrities as if he had been an eyewitness to their deeds. Whenever skeptical historians tried to trip up the Count by questioning him about trivial historical details that were not widely known, the Count would always reply with astonishing accuracy, leaving the questioner quite perplexed. The Count's claim to be much older than he looked was reinforced one day when the old Countess von Georgi met him. She immediately recognized the enigmatic nobleman as the same individual she had met 50 years previously in Venice, where she had been the ambassadress. But she was amazed that the Count still looked the same age as he had then, which was about 45. The Countess was naturally confused by this, and asked him if his father had been in Venice at that time. The Count shook his head and told her that it had been he, and proceeded to baffle the Countess by telling her how beautiful she had looked as a young woman, and how he had enjoyed playing her favorite musical piece on the violin. The Countess recoiled in disbelief and told him, "Why, you must be 100 years old." "That is not impossible," replied the Count. "You are a most extraordinary man," exclaimed the old Countess. "A devil." The comparison to a demon touched a sore point in the Count, and in a raised voice he replied, "For pity's sake, no such names." He then turned his back on the shocked Countess and stormed out of the room. The King of France, Louis XV, was intrigued by the stories of the mysterious Count Saint Germain. He sought him out, and offered him an invitation to attend the royal court. The Count accepted the invitation, and succeeded in captivating the king and his courtiers, as well as Madame de Pompadour, the king's mistress. During the spectacular banquets that were held at the court, the Count would abstain from food and wine, but would sometimes sip mineral water instead. Furthermore, when the Count did dine, it was always in private. Precisely what he did consume is not known, although some of the courtiers claimed he was a vegetarian. In 1745, the year of the Jacobite rebellion in Britain, the Count Saint Germain turned up in London, where he was arrested on a charge of spying. Horace Walpole, the son of Sir Robert Walpole, Britain's first Prime Minister, mentioned the incident in a letter to his lifelong correspondent, Sir Horace Mann. Walpole wrote, "The other day they seized an odd man who goes by the name of the Count Saint Germain. He has been here these 2 years, and will not tell who he is or whence, but professes that he does not go by his right name. He sings and plays on the violin wonderfully, is mad, and not very sensible." At a time when English xenophobia was at an all-time high because many foreigners, especially Frenchmen, were known to be sympathetic to the Jacobite cause, the Count should have been imprisoned, but instead he was released. Just why this occurred is still a mystery. One curious report that circulated at the time claimed that the Count used hypnotic suggestion to persuade his detainers that he was innocent. This is a real possibility. Anton Mesmer, who is credited with the discovery of hypnotism, had stated years before that the Count possessed a vast understanding of the workings of the human mind, and had been directly responsible for teaching him the art of hypnosis. In 1756, the Count was spotted by Sir Robert Clive in India, and in 1760, history records that King Louis XV sent Monsieur Saint Germain to The Hague to help settle the peace treaty between Prussia and Austria. In 1762, the Count took part in the deposition of Peter III of Russia, and played an active role in bringing Catherine the Great to the throne. The Count Saint Germain opened a mass production factory in Venice in 1769, where he developed a synthetic form of silk. During this period, he also executed several magnificent sculptures in the tradition of the classical Greeks. A year later, he was again active in interfering in the politics of other nations. This time he was seen in the uniform of a Russian general with Prince Alexei Orlov in Leghorn. After the death of Louis XV in 1774, the man from nowhere turned up unexpectedly in Paris and warned the new monarch, King Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette, of the approaching danger of the French Revolution, which he described as a gigantic conspiracy that would overthrow the order of things. Of course, the warning went unheeded, and among the final entries in her diary, Marie Antoinette recorded her regret at not taking the Count's advice. In February 1784, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, Germany, announced the news that the Count was dead and was to be buried at the local church in Eckernford. Among the crowds that attended the funeral service were many prominent occultists, including Count Cagliostro, Anton Mesmer, and the philosopher Louis Saint Martin. The coffin was lowered into the grave, and many of the mourners sobbed at what seemed so unbelievable, the death of the immortal Count. But that is not the end of the story. A year later, a Congress of Freemasons was held in Paris. Among the Rosicrucians, Kabbalists, and Illuminati was the supposedly dead Count Saint Germain. 36 years after his funeral, the Count was seen by scores of people in Paris. These included the diarist Mademoiselle d'Adhémar and the educationalist Madame de Genlis. Both women said the Count still looked like a 45-year-old. In 1870, the Emperor Napoleon III was so fascinated by the reports of the undying Count that he ordered a special commission to be set up at the Hotel de Ville to investigate the nobleman. But the findings of the commission never came to a conclusion because, in 1871, a mysterious fire gutted the Hotel de Ville, destroying every document that related to the self-styled Count. The Count Saint Germain was then briefly seen in Milan in 1867, attending a meeting of the Grand Lodge of Freemasons. In 1896, Theosophist Annie Besant said she had met the Count, and around the same year, Russian Theosophist Madame Blavatsky said the Count had been in contact with her. She proclaimed that he belonged to a race of immortals who lived in a subterranean country called Shambhala, north of the Himalayas. In 1897, the French singer Emma Cave also claimed that the Count Saint Germain had paid her a visit, and she called him a great chiromancer who had told her many truths. The story of the immortal Count went out of vogue at the beginning of the 20th century until August 1914. in the early days of World War I, when two Bavarian soldiers captured a Jewish-looking Frenchman in Alsace. During the all-night interrogation, the prisoner of war stubbornly refused to give his name. Suddenly, in the early hours of the morning, the unidentified Frenchman got very irritable and started to rant about the futility of the war. He told his captors, "Throw down your guns. The war will end in 1918 with defeat for the German nation and her allies." One of the soldiers, Andreas Rill, laughed at the prisoner's words. He thought that the man was merely expressing the hopes of every Frenchman, but he was intrigued by the prisoner's other prophecies. Everyone will be a millionaire after the war. There will be so much money in circulation, people will throw it from windows, and no one will bother to pick it up. You will need to carry it around in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf, the Frenchman predicted. Was he referring to the rampant inflation of post-World War I Germany? The soldiers scoffed at the predictions, but they let the prophet ramble on. He gave them more future history lessons. After the confetti money will come the Antichrist, a tyrant from the lower classes who will wear an ancient symbol. He will lead Germany into another global war in 1939, but will be defeated 6 years on after doing inhuman, unspeakable things. The Frenchman then started to become incoherent. He started to sing, then began to sob. Thinking he was mad, the soldiers decided to let him go, and he disappeared back into obscurity. His identity is still unknown. Could he have been the Count Saint-Germain? Today, most historians regard the Count Saint-Germain as nothing more than a silver-tongued charlatan. But there are so many unanswered questions. What was the source of the Count's wealth? How can we possibly explain his longevity? For that matter, where did he come from? If he had been an impostor, surely someone would have recognized him. The only surviving manuscript written by the Count, entitled L'Atre Saint Trinosophy, is in the library at the Troyes, France, and to date it has resisted every attempt to be fully deciphered. But one decoded section of the text states, "We moved through space at a speed that can be compared with nothing but itself. Within a fraction of a second, the plains below us were out of sight, and the earth had become a faint nebula." What does this signify? Could it be that the Count Saint-Germain was some type of traveler in space and time? A renegade Time Lord from the future who liked to meddle with history? If this were so, perhaps he really had talked with Christ and the kings of bygone days. The end of the story. This was a story from a book called Strange but True, Mysterious and Bizarre People by the author Thomas Slemen.